Back to interview mode. I guess I'll introduce you now. I always get in trouble because I always start rambling for a while instead of introducing the guest. And it's a guest I'm very, very excited to have. We're here with a man known as Thamster Witnat, a.k.a. Tyler Hamilton. He is billed as a dissident phenomenological philosopher, and he's the host of two shows I really like, Theopolitics and the Euro Bureau of Literaturo, top 5 best name for a thing. Both of those are available on Odyssey as well as YouTube. And Tyler, unless I'm mistaken, you also have, is it a Gumroad or Subscribe Star for a paywall show?
We do have a Gumroad as well for Theopolitics. We are going to integrate EBL member exclusives on there as well soon. But right now, Theopolitics has a Gumroad.
These are two great shows on the many, many different topics, but the reason I like them is deep dives into philosophy. And there's one more thing in your bio that I might need some help with. So we're going to have to go on this road together. It is Kyokushin Karateka. Is that a martial arts thing, correct?
Yeah, that's Kyokushin Karate.
All right. Now, before we start, people probably want to get to the meat of everything, but I want to know a bit more about karate. I need to know. So let me know why you picked karate. And I say this as a guy who took some karate growing up as a teen. However, I might have just taken fat white kid karate. So I don't know if I got the good stuff.
Well, I mean, part of the issue with public perception of karate largely comes from like dojos springing up after the movie Karate Kid came out. And so you had a lot of dojos trying to aim towards kids, and they kind of took out a lot of the combative elements of it. And you generally had that proliferate in the 80s and forward. So you often hear kids say, oh, okay, well, I took karate as a kid, not really that serious as a martial art. Go take boxing or Muay Thai instead, or whatever have you. I like those things too. But karate there's many different styles of it. And as far as Kyokushin goes, it's not anything like you would see in the Olympics, like the kind of point karate or the overly wide stance where you scream and do one punch and then you're done. Or you just practice, say, kata all day, although you do some kata. Kyokushin is a bare knuckle style of karate. So the average Kyokushin competition would be what's called knockdown kumite. So you can't punch to the head, but you can punch to the body. You could knee, you could kick to the head, kick to the thighs, and all that. And the whole philosophy behind it is basically mental and physical toughness. So the workouts are designed to push you past your limits and really get you sweating. And I've done all kinds of martial arts, but I've never had one that was a physical challenge as much as Kyokushin. And it does carry over. Yeah, it does carry over into combat sports too. I mean, GSP, Bas Rutten, Rico Verhoeven, all kinds of actually high-level kickboxers and MMA fighters have a Kyokushin background. And there's a lot more influence from Kyokushin in, say, Dutch kickboxing. It's one of the 3 main pillars alongside boxing and Muay Thai you'd find in Dutch kickboxing. So it has a lot of impact beyond. But generally, you hear the word karate, you think of just dive in with one punch and scream and get a point. It's not anything like that. It's a very tough martial art.
Well, that's fascinating because that's not a karate that you usually hear about. And I'm not being sarcastic for anyone listening because now, full disclosure, yes, I took karate. You're saying dimes. What level did you get to? Well, it was actually a green belt. Thank you very much. Now you're saying dimes. And what kind of class were you in? What kind of dojo were you in? Doesn't matter. Were you surrounded by various ages of children? Yes, I was. Dimes. Did you actually have to spar with a little girl half your size? Yes, I did. And I do it again. Now, and you're saying, well, I thought this was just to lose weight. I took it very seriously. I harassed that child across. Why did they pair us up? You tell me. I don't know. Now, that's my experience with karate. Now, I know that might be other people's experiences as well. But what I found interesting about that is that you chose karate. It's not just you got, you stuck with it and then you experienced other martial arts. And I find it fascinating that, this is something you don't hear about. Now, do you feel it's not taken seriously in the world of martial arts, or am I just blocked out of that world entirely?
No, I mean I think you're partly right. I think it's largely a PR problem though, because whenever you watch, say, MMA or something or kickboxing, whenever someone has a Muay Thai background or some other style of kickboxing or whatever, they usually boast about it being Muay Thai. But as far as, say, the Kyokushin influence, like Japanese kickboxing, K1, Dutch kickboxing, these things have a Kyokushin background. But you don't really hear people talk about it, right? Like the story goes that I think it was 1962, I don't remember exactly, but three top Thai champions invited Japanese karateka to go essentially challenge them in a who's better match. And every style of karate lost until Kyokushin came along. And they sent three Kyokushin practitioners there, one of which was the coach, actually, because he ended up, his name's Kenji Kurosaki. He ended up having to substitute at the last minute for one of the third guys who had to drop out. So they had a Kyokushin versus Muay Thai bout. And Kyokushin won 2 out of 3 of them. The only one that lost was the trainer. And he was, inspired by Muay Thai as an art in the sense of, fighting in the ring, fighting with gloves, punches to the face, that kind of thing. So he had a bit of a clash with the founder of Kyokushin, Master Oyama, because Oyama didn't want to remove the bare knuckle fighting aspect and make it like a ring, kind of like geared towards the ring, while Kenji wanted there to be that way. And so he left and he formed the Maijoro Jam, and people like John Blooming brought it back to the Netherlands. And then that became the influence for Dutch kickboxing. And there's a lot of high-level practitioners in kickboxing that come from that style. But you don't hear people talk about it as much. Doesn't have as much of a strong PR as, say, other systems, right?
Yeah,
Like
Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is probably the biggest meme martial art right now, I would imagine.
Well, and the other thing is, I mean, if we're talking about karate in general, it's because, and this goes back to the 20s and later in Japan and after World War II, was in the 20s, boxing showed up. I think it was one of the matches between Jack Dempsey and I can't remember the Irishman's name. But that made huge waves around the world, and people in Japan were like, wow, this is amazing, this Western boxing. And the Japanese government, they needed something to be like, okay, we have our version too, right? Because we have judo, which is our version of wrestling. Well, we need something to replace Western boxing. And so they went to Okinawa and they found karate. But then they had an issue, is because karate originally is not a style of just punching and kicking. It's actually more so close range grappling that incorporates strikes, because there was a mixture of Okinawan wrestling and various striking arts from around, like, say, Thailand and China and the Philippines, because Okinawa was a seaport. And so they integrated that into what's called karate. It wasn't called that back then, but it was essentially one of the first MMA, basically, was what it was. And so you go and you read old karate books, you'll find throws in there, you'll find takedowns, you'll find groundwork, you'll find all kinds of different kinds of grappling in it. It was meant to be a whole complete system. But then when they were like, okay, well, we need something to challenge boxing, they started taking that stuff out when it moved to mainland Japan, which pissed off a lot of Okinawans, and as a part of a Japanese nationalist program, as like creating their martial arts, basically their practice of Budo. So it reduced it to just a punch kick system and took out most of all the other aspects of it that made it an effective martial art. And so you have that, but the good stuff, karate still existed alongside of it. But then, of course, it goes to the West. You get Karate Kid. Everyone wants to be like that in the movie. So dojos, they just started teaching a very watered down version of it. And so people ended up with black belts that probably shouldn't have. It cheapened the whole thing. And now when people think of karate, they think of zipping in and out and getting a point and yelling. And yeah.
In a way, it's kind of like everyone's seen those videos of high school debates. Typically, they're with like really, really fat black girls, but it's actually a style of debate where they're trained to make as many points as quickly as possible to the point where it's unintelligible. So, karate, we could say, unfortunately became the obese high school student debate of, martial arts, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, like with Kyokushin, you can tell when it is someone has a Kyokushin background. It's more of a square stance. It's more of it in the pocket kind of fighting. It doesn't really look anything like, say, Shotokan, where you're blitzing in and out and you're always hopping on your feet. That all being said, I actually don't want to down talk some of the more like Olympic point style, like what you'd see Shotokan practitioners doing, because when you have people like Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, you have Lyoto Machida, you have Michael Venom Page. Clearly, people can make that style work in full contact. I don't think it's, if you wanted to take a martial art and you want to do karate, I would say do Kyokushin or any of its offshoots. But I don't like knocking the other karate styles either, because they do make it work. We've seen it happen. So,
well, it makes me wonder if having bad PR works for your favor, because we've seen what happens when there's great PRs, that you get a flood of people. I mean, I recall my late teens, early 20s. I don't know why it happened, but it was Krav Maga. Krav Maga was on the tip of everyone's tongue. I guess everyone just wanted to be a Mossad agent for like 10 years. And then it became Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. But it makes me think that karate being treated as this sort of thing to the side, now you can have people who take it seriously. You're not surrounded by grifters.
actually, you're entirely right about that. Because karate had all the great PR in the '80s, and then look where that went, right? Um, and then one of the things now I've seen, like B2J has very high standards, which is great. That's the way it should be. And same, but we've also I've watched a lot of YouTube videos lately of various BJJ influencers or whatever practitioners talking about how some schools are starting to water it down because you have to accommodate the demand. And quite frankly, you got to make money. You have all these new students, but you have to lower the standards to keep them in. And so, yes, mostly across the board, the high standards are still there, but there's a lot of reports of it starting to drop in a lot of places, which is exactly what happened to karate in the '80s, and same with Muay Thai, right? Like I found it really odd, but I've heard stories of them some play gyms incorporating like belt systems or sashes, which just doesn't exist in Muay Thai, right? It shouldn't, but they've started incorporating these things because it's becoming more popular. And another thing I'll say is the bad PR and the dominance of MMA, I think, has actually helped karate realize its roots again. Because, like I said, it lost a lot of that grappling emphasis, which was originally very present. And so you look at like the kata movements, for example. People, well, why do you do kata, or why do you block in such a weird way? Well, the actual reason is because they're not blocks, right? Uke means to receive; it doesn't mean to block. So you watch movies and you'll like watch them do karate blocks to bunch punches and kicks. It's not really what it's for. They're actually grappling moves, and kata was a way of practicing that when you were by yourself, basically. And so what they've been rediscovering lately is the application of bunkai, which is basically the practical steps that are supposed to go with the kata, basically the application of them. And what you find is that, yeah, like it sounds like a bit of a broken record here, but most of that is various forms of grappling. That's why the movements look so weird. That's why the blocks look so weird. But they've been forced to rediscover that because, oh, we've hit reality all of a sudden. You can't block this way, right? This doesn't make any sense. It's not what the kata was for. So I think it's rediscovering its martial roots because it's allowed to do that because it's less popular now.
Well, that's fascinating. I love that because, for people wondering why we're talking so much about karate, one, it's my show. I can actually do whatever I want, by the way. And two, I'm getting flashbacks from me as a kid learning this, because that did strike me that they did not connect those dots of the blocks being part of a grappling technique. So I remember being taught what were called blocks and not really understanding why these were blocks, because they're very specific, but then they kind of stop short from what they, I guess, should have been.
Well, that's the thing. It's like the upper block, for example, Jodan Uke. You watch someone do that, and it's like sometimes teachers will tell you, they'll be like, well, this is to block an upper kick, like a kick coming down on your forehead. But you look at where your arm's placed, you're not going to block it that way. You just might absorb a tiny amount of impact and you're going to get knocked out and you're going to hit in the head. It's not going to work as an upper block. So that doesn't make sense. But then if you take that same move and then, someone's grabbing you, they have the control over your arms, right? And so you're in that grappling situation. All of a sudden, the upper block, if you perform it, the blocking hand is going to end up hitting them under their chin. And the down hand, which is the receiving hand, the hikite, basically means pulling hand. It's the same thing. When you see people do those weird chambered punches in karate, they have their hands all the way back to their
Yeah.
right. But that is supposed to be is you pulling your hand as if like you're grabbing them or something, kind of like you're playing hockey and you're grabbing someone's jersey and you're holding on to it to hit them with the other hand. That's actually what that's supposed to be. So
This is wild. Everything is just becoming illuminated right now. Now it makes sense because I'm flashing back because I did this for years and just the repetitiveness of it. And then now I'm like, why did we do that? Oh, now it comes into complete focus.
well, that's the thing is it's like a lot of the older European judo masters when they started learning judo. When they discovered karate, they said this is basically a more efficient version, which just sounds very odd to say. But I mean, if you go to an average judo dojo, you go to an average karate dojo, you're going to learn how to fight better at the judo dojo, to be real. You got to really pick where you learn karate if you want to do it. And like I said, Kyokushin's a good way to do that. You'll always across the board, it's tough training. But anyway, so like if you perform Jodan Uke, your blocking hand, it unbalances them by either hitting them in the throat or under the chin. And so then where's your pulling hand? It's moving down their body and it's breaking their balance. And so essentially your hands are right over the thigh so you can go for a single leg takedown, for example. Or you could maybe do some other kind of throw. It's meant to mold into the different ways that you can use it. So it's meant to train your body that way. And so, yeah, there's a strong practical application there. And because of that declining popularity, it's been able to be explored more fully rather than, we got 100 kids in the class, just rush them through. Right? And even the kids class I watched the bell test for it once because I had to do a test recently. A brutal test. I ended up doing 6 fights in a row, which was taxing on the body. I could barely walk for like a week and a half.
This guy's serious, if anyone was wondering.
Thighs were all bruised and all that, but it's exhilarating. It's really exhilarating. That the full contact experience it's exhilarating. It really pushes your limits when you're trying to keep pushing through it. Right, you're starting to gas out a little. You're getting tired, you're getting hit minute after minute, but luckily, hopefully you're hitting back, right, and all that. But
yeah, that's much different than my experience, which was, for the record, if anyone's paying attention, literally that episode of Seinfeld where Kramer was taking karate and just like bum rushes the child.
Well, see, the funny is like the kids belt test. So they have the kids fighting each other, and even there they don't coddle them. I remember one kid wasn't fighting back during his exam, and I could just hear my sensei. He's this old Polish guy from the former Eastern Bloc, and so he ended up. They ended up basically practicing under secret by saying it was like a dance studio. But what they were doing their fight, one kid wasn't fighting back, and I just hear him yell, like, "If he's not going to fight back, then just beat his ass." It's like, so like, all right, well, this is real training, man, and. So if anyone wants to do good karate, yeah, it is out there, but you kind of gotta dig for it a little.
Well, again, I'm interested in just hearing you speak about its integration over time with various European cultures, because like you just mentioning, the teacher is this old Eastern Bloc, probably, I'm imagining tough as nails. Maybe he's not, but give me this if he's not.
He definitely is, yeah.
Yeah. So like this is probably a very broad question, but have you found like the pathway that karate took is uniquely appealing to Western people, perhaps over other martial arts?
Well, that's a really good point. I would say part of that is, all the high kicks you see in karate, and I guess, Taekwondo took them over too. They aren't Japanese. They're French. They come from Zavat. They were directly inspired by French. The original karate, you look at like very old school traditional karate, they only had low kicks, which I mean it was great, obviously, but they actually incorporated a lot of European stylings there. savate would be the obvious one, with like the high kicks and the roundhouse kicks and all that stuff. It doesn't Japanese didn't they got that from savate, but yeah, I would say there's maybe there is an influence there. I think from after World War II, when all the officers were stationed in Okinawa, and then the spread of Kyokushin and harder styles throughout Russia and Eastern Europe, which it is also maybe one of the reasons you don't hear about it as much here. It's like some of the harder styles are more common in Russia. They have, for example, there the Senshi challenge. It's called, which is does like a full contact kickboxing matches, and you'll find a lot of Kyokushin practitioners in there going toe to toe with Muay Thai and the rest. And it's not very full of much rivalry. Like there's a lot more integrated kind of warrior culture there with martial arts in general. While here, on the other hand, it's the difference is, and this is where I think it gets really interesting. Is it's been kind of commodified in like I hate to sound like one of those like Edward Said Orientalist kinds of ways, Orientalist theory, but it's kind of like a great Eastern other, like, oh, this is such an interesting mystical practice, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that kind of goes along with what was integrated into Budo in Japan, which is karate do as a way of life rather than karate ju, like karate as basically practical combat. And we kind of emphasize that more here because it's commodifying a certain lifestyle, right? You find that in movies, right? Again, like the aforementioned Karate Kid. It's more of a commodified thing here. It's more of like a self-help.
That's absolutely true. And for people who want to see even a new example of that, you can watch the show Cobra Kai, which is the sequel to Karate Kid, and it's very much not just the martial art, but the wider, not even just the wider Japanese culture, but a probably very specific interpretation of Japanese culture to seem as Japanese as possible, but also as vague as possible.
Yeah, 100%. And like one thing I want to, while for example in the Eastern Europe appropriation of karate, it's a lot more true to what it's supposed to be, which is hard training. And my rejoinder to a lot of which is something I really hate. People are like, oh, I go to this dojo. Yeah, doesn't fight very hard, doesn't spar very hard, but it's spiritual, it's healthy, it's about like cultivating a mindset. It's like that's bullshit. It's like, look, one thing the founder of Kyokushin said was the only secret is sweat. Right? What you're going to get more spiritual benefit from real hard training that pushes you past your physical limits than you are going to be about spouting bullshit philosophy while doing some kind of point sparring where you don't actually ever hit each other. What is actually going to test you as a man? It's going to be the continuous hard contact fighting, right? That's how it works. That's how original karate should be.
And then we got Thamster over here walking in with that Catholic swagger saying, you don't need none of that spirituality. You got it covered.
Well, so I just mean like, that's one thing that's lost is the value of embodiment, basically. I mean, we tend to think of spirituality as something that you have to become detached and cultivate kind of like a feminine mindset. And, it's part of the value of understanding embodiment is that you only progress spiritually, mentally, to the extent that you're engaged in that project out in the world. Right? You're testing your limits. You're seeing how God created you to be, and you're living up to it. You're living up to that calling. So
I liked what you just said there, which was interesting, which you had said that was a defined, feminine aspect of this sort of detached spirituality. And is that a common thread you've seen throughout, where a certain interpretation of spirituality being feminine means it just exists apart and in this sort of abstract, performative way?
Yeah, it exists in a way, performative, but it exists in the way of nurturing and self-care is what I mean by feminine. So
okay.
So it's a very dangerous mix too. I'm not saying, the feminine in itself is, but like, for example, someone will go to spiritual guidance or psychological guidance because they're having issues in their life, right? We all know what the issues are. like men and women, they don't have great relationships now. Everything's so atomized that nobody has any sense of who or what they should be or what their role is to be as a man. And then you mix that in with, you're in a system where you're paid very low wages. You're essentially, most people are living paycheck to paycheck. They don't feel they have much of a future, so then they get depressed, but they don't really know why, because they're so surrounded by technology, consumer goods, and you have a big screen TV most instances, even if you are really poor. And so, like, well, why am I upset? What am I supposed to do about this? I don't understand why. As well as you couple that with the fact that we kind of take it as a common sense understanding, these very liberal notions of individualism and self-choice. And so we don't look at it at a dimension of, well, maybe there's something wrong with how we conceive the person here in this culture in the first place. And so the person essentially ends up lost. What they look to, they find these kind of like meditative self-care methods, like, oh, well, cultivate mindfulness, and you can cultivate compassion in all your relations. And so it essentially teaches you to step back as an individual and to try to cultivate a kind of empty mindset, whatever that means, so that you're able to assess the situation with more compassion. In other words, it's basically reducing it back to an individual level rather than looking at the whole of what's actually causing these disturbances, and integrates you into the economic system.
And I still catch myself doing that because I think a lot of people, especially Westerners, especially you and I are both Canadians, that maybe this is unique to, maybe not unique, but more pronounced in Canada. But when you're raised in these systems and in these paradigms, you do it without even thinking. So I'll catch myself sometimes thinking, like, what's it like to be them? What, always bringing myself down to like the what do I know? I don't know anything. I'm not them. As a Pavlovian response to these situations, I gotta like catch myself, because this does bleed into politics, which is that you ought not have an opinion on things that are not directly your own purview, in a sense. Like I cannot permit myself to have a positive or a negative feeling about anything anyone else is doing, period. But I should spend an inordinate amount of time trying to imagine myself as them. So you just end up in this sort of amorphous kind of, you're not really connected to anyone either. You just feel this vague existence that nobody's really happy with.
Yeah, that's entirely well said. And an important point to add to that is the number one spiritual practices among like CEOs of Silicon Valley, Google, is these very same pseudo-spiritual psychological practices of mindfulness, right? Or the kind of like hijacked Eastern meditation of Buddhism. And well, what's the reason? You cultivate compassion, right? So the idea here is that, well, if you just step back from your interests in yourself and like your attachments, then you could realize your true compassionate self, and everything's okay, and we'll have a more just ordering of the system. But all it does is it permits you to disattach from the consequences. And it's like the perfect ideological varnish, because it keeps people at the bottom from questioning, like, okay, well, is the reason my functioning is so poor right now is because there's something fundamentally wrong with the whole cultural milieu that we live in. And instead, you're trying to integrate yourself into this kind of disattached notion where if we just, we just meditate, we sit back, we reflect on who we truly are, right? There's that individual thing thrown in there. Who we really am, then we would all recognize each other's beauty. Now, see, this is why I was juxtaposing it to the experience of, say, doing bare knuckle fighting in Kyokushin. Why I was saying that was more spiritual. And anyone who does boxing or judo, they'll wrestling, they know what I mean. It's the same thing. I'm not making like a raw chest pumping point here, or like a Bronze Age pervert point about like your physique, as if that's what masculinity is. What I'm saying is the reason I'm saying that's more authentically spiritual is because when you're in the middle of that kind of training, right? You're in the middle of that kind of, you're fighting, basically. You are constantly going outside of yourself. You're not looking inwards to try to disattach and look for some inner core. Your body is struggling to keep up. You're trying to breathe right. You're trying to mentally focus to stay in the game, to stay focused. And in that instance, you actually have to toughen up. And it's there where you find the kind of transcendence which makes humans truly human and which makes humans in the image of God, is this ability to push through the natural instincts of, say, fight or flight. And that to me is a far more spiritual experience than just pushing back and looking up some nice words about compassion or something, right?
You made a lot of great points there, but one that kind of stuck out to me, and I want to maybe dive into this a bit more. But you had mentioned sort of like this. I don't want to. I don't want to back you in a corner where it sounds like we're picking a beef, because we're not. But I do know it's like with Bronze Age pervert, for example, there is this trend. It's still popular. It was popular more before, but it is now. We might call it performative masculinity. That's not really what I mean, but it's sort of almost this pseudo ironic version of masculinity where it's like sunning your balls and having a harem and stuff. And I was wondering, but I hear you talk, and you're very much you're athletic and you like to fight. You like to do similar things, but it's a completely different tone and with a completely different angle to it. I would argue more practical. And I was wondering your thoughts on whatever the BAP sphere, whatever, because there's a lot of people who are like having, Twitter photos of like ripped bronzed guys and that they obviously don't look like. But I was wondering if you think you exist parallel to this other form of, combat friendly masculinity that seems perhaps less real or more ironic, or do you see what I'm saying? Like, what do you think of all that?
Well, I mean, I entirely agree that it's performative masculinity. I know, like you might want to step back a little from that, but I actually entirely think it is. I mean, it's very gay. When you're just looking at, you're obsessed with pictures of yourself in the mirror. You're obsessed with looking at other men and looking at their bodies. This is masculinity. And I saw people, for example, complain about Catholicism, saying, well, there's not enough masculinity here. And that was coming from a lot of the BAP sphere. Now it's like, okay, well, we just had the year of St. Joseph. And the whole message the church was teaching is that men were valuing the hard work that you do to look after your family and to do the right thing and to be a man who's willing to risk persecution for the sake of the truth and to look after his family and to say yes when God calls you, right? St. Joseph, the worker, to work hard, to see your hands in calluses, right? It was emphasizing what a man is, right? A man as a protector, as a provider. But these aren't things you can just look at in an idealized way, right? And to me, when it comes to a lot of that kind of post-physique mindset, it's just the way it looks for the aesthetic, but it's an aesthetic disattached from any kind of notion of practice, right? Now, I will clarify and say, yeah, I do respect a lot of bodybuilders. In fact, fun fact, my mom was a former bodybuilding competitor.
Cool.
Yeah, she was actually, I think, third place in the nationals. But it takes a lot of discipline to do bodybuilding. I get it. There is a lot to it. You do have to cultivate a lot of discipline to do that. But when it just becomes this incessant post-physique thing rather than any kind of practical application of being a man. And a lot of these men, like, I don't want to slander it in this way, but, like, we're dating OnlyFans whores and shit. It's you're not really cultivating a manly practice, which is standing online looking at dudes' physiques all day and then haranguing people. I'm like, oh, well, you don't do that. Where's your physique? That's not what it is. It's the willingness to undergo. I have more respect for, say, the man who tests himself in the ring, or the man who looks after his family and works hours and hours, not because I think it's modern wage slaving is a good thing, but because they're taking on the role for the people that they care about. And that's the kind of man that's worth respecting. The man who shows up, the man who is willing to undergo that kind of self-transformation needed to become a protector and a provider. And that's not something you can stare at. That's not something you can aestheticize. I mean, bodybuilders don't look like fighters.
Well, that's so interesting and I'm kind of feeling my way in the dark on this, and I'm going to use an example that might divide some of the audience because I'm going to talk about gangster rap. I know my audience listens to either, pagan chants, lo-fi, or suicidal synthwave, so they might not have a lot of the inputs necessary to understand this. But the metaphor I'm thinking of would be gangster rap versus actual gangsters. someone like a Rick Ross, the gangsta rapper, not the gangster. So it's like you have a lot of the pomp and circumstance, and you have the tales, and you have the selfies, as opposed to an actual gangster who would not talk so much about being a gangster. Now, it may be true that this metaphor sounded better in my head than it does coming out of my mouth. That's fair. But it's out there now, and now it's in everyone else's head. And I think it's just as true now as when it was said.
Yeah, well, I mean, your point is taken. Like, I mean, one could argue, well, the practice of bodybuilding, there actually are bodybuilders, so they do something, which I get. But I mean, if it's all for the image of vanity, it's for the aesthetic of masculinity, but not the roles and responsibilities that come with it. And if you have the time to spend mogging people on Twitter saying post physique, and then that becomes the standard by which you measure whether or not a man should even be giving his opinion, because that's the idea that goes there. It's like, well, if you got our physique, then you're able to give your opinion, or else your opinion doesn't matter. Well, it's like, well, one, most of you guys, I mean, sorry, bodybuilding does not translate into toughness. It doesn't. I'm not saying strength doesn't matter, but bodybuilding is not primarily about strength.
Yeah, well, and it's true. Well, there's, and because I box in my spare time, and I do some working out. But I remember hearing recently, because there's been a lot of people training for fights recently, people saying that you need to train with the heavy bag, you need to train with something that fights back. And there's a lot of people who even say they're training for fighting, but they'll just train with a trainer hitting the pads, and they'll say, no, you actually need to hit something with weight and know how to move and things like that. But I do think so. That kind of touches on something that I didn't plan on talking about, but as we're talking, it occurs to me, and I don't know how deep I'm going to go with this, but it sounds like there's almost a danger of aestheticization. And I'm going to be speaking to another guy from our sphere named Gio Pinaccetti coming up in the next week or so. And he's an arts guy, he's an aesthetics guy, and he has the value of aesthetics at the forefront of his mind. But it makes me think that there are pitfalls with being concerned about aesthetics. And we see this in our scene everywhere. All of our memes are aesthetic worship, it as such in itself. I mean, just like, we don't need to even talk about all like the trad memes and everything. But on top of that, there is just, from a political standpoint, like, we just like the pictures of the things, because I don't know how else to describe it, but our entire future worldview is so tethered to just how things look that I don't think, I'm not saying everyone, but for a good chunk of the dissident right writ large, there's people who are only going aesthetic deep with anything. And I think, it's like, just back to the gangster rap thing, it's like there is a point where the fake gangster rapper does become more rich and powerful and culturally relevant than the gangster, as sort of like a simulacra of some kind. And it's just interesting to see that the worst thing in the world you could think of is if in our scene the people who are just too obsessed with aesthetics were to gain power, it would be some corrupted, compromised simulacrum, right? I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm just talking.
Well, I mean, I could. There's a lot I could chime in there with, because you're making good points.
Please do.
Like, one of the issues with just focusing on aesthetics, because I'm not saying aesthetics is wrong. Like, I'm a good old classic Platonist when it comes to this, is I think the aesthetic, the good, the true, and the beautiful, that they're one when you truly understand them. But when you try to remove that, now you try to remove their connection to the good and the true. So you just have the aesthetic. So the idea here is, okay, you cultivate an image of masculinity, and then you therefore have the power in which you can make up the rules, and everyone else has to listen because you have the image of masculinity. That isn't traditionalist. That's not right wing. That's postmodernism. That is Michel Foucault. I mean, straight up, they don't like that comparison, but it's the same idea. It 100% is. I mean, in fact, Foucault's word for it was the aestheticization of the self, right? But you got to remember, this is relativistic. So someone might look at that comparison and be like, well, I'm not valuing the same thing as like a progressive left or postmodern left. It's like, of course, but the idea here is that our self-understanding comes from who has the most power and who is able to essentially set the tone, right? And so they are simply on the other side of it. but the understanding is the same, right? It's the postmodern understanding of power and truth. It's this relativization of the aesthetic away from what's good and what's true. And so, in that regard, oftentimes, say the right wing Nietzschean, they're not really any different. And they usually don't realize that either. And you point it out, and then they just say something like, "Oh, well, you don't really get it," and then they don't really tell you much to go from other than that, right? This is where that kind of relativistic will to power thinking ends up going. And so, yeah, in that regard, one good way in which I think Plato is very instructive is we tend to have this idea, and you see this with like the repeated instances on Stoicism, the Stoics. Why can I not speak right now? The idea is like, okay, well, this is increased emphasis on discipline to cultivate your image of masculinity, right? Do this discipline in practice. Now, I'm not saying these things are bad, obviously. But what Plato was warning against in the Republic is he's saying, for example, if you can discipline the passions, that in itself is not good enough. You could still be a completely manipulative person. In fact, you can be a Patrick Bateman. You can present an image, you can have the best self-control possible, and then you could work your way up to the top. And you could still carry out some of the worst kinds of political governance. So Plato would say, well, reason has to participate in the forms. It has to participate in the religious. It has to be subservient to something other than itself, other than ideals of self-control. But we tend to look at things like self-control and discipline as if they're ends in itself, and that's going to guarantee good character. But it doesn't. I mean, does every fighter, everyone that's pushed through the difficulties they face to reach a position of influence end up having good governance or make good ethical decisions? No, it simply means you're able to control your passions so you can get to a position of privilege and power, and then you can put out the kind of wonk policies that you want. And so, like, would I want the paths, fear, and power? Absolutely not. The whole ideal there is just the same kind of thing. It's the pursuit of power in and of itself, and it's elevated to almost a metaphysic, right? You see this when the NRX sphere is pretty guilty of this too. They say things like power does this, power does that. It's like, well, no, power doesn't do anything. Power is just a kind of relative output of what you're able to achieve in a given system. But how power functions is subservient to that kind of symbolic worldview that we inhabit. It's not something that's a consistent throughout history.
And I wanted to get to that in a second. I just wanted to clarify for some people, because that's a very, very great point you just made. And I think another way to look at it is, if people recall over the past few years, a lot of the atheist sphere names come to mind would be someone like Sam Harris, a lot of the secularists who say that, I think even Stefan Molyneux might be one of them, who, a lot of the anarchist people are like this as well, where they're like, oh, we don't need any sort of theological, any foundational morals. We can create what I would describe as just an advanced legalistic framework of human behavior, which is kind of what you were talking about, that, oh, you can have someone who behaves in a certain way and follows the rules and obeys the law, but the entire time there's something rotten in them that has not been addressed. And in true to form, the most manipulative, corrupt, sociopathic people tend to be the ones who can follow the rules the best. And so I just found that interesting that, before we can go off on the weeds on this all day, where we could say, as the civilization begins to decline, we need more laws and rules for things that we never needed in the past. And we wonder aloud, why do we need laws for this now? Because people just didn't do it in the past. It never occurred to them that we needed a punishment for this new thing called a child drag show that would never have occurred to someone in the past. But I love that idea, because this is where we'll get into phenomenology. I think that just having the framework itself cannot be enough, because it can't even police itself that well, I think, is the issue we were getting at, right?
Well, entirely. I mean, like, let me develop that point a little further, because you'll often hear people say, okay, well, how do we solve, maybe this is like academic agents, clear them out kind of thing, or whatever he says. And then it's okay, clear them out. Now we have our guys in there. What's like, so what? Because the issue is, people say, well, what would be a kind of legitimacy qualification for a politician? And so some people on the right, they might say, okay, well, they're the strong man, or they have merit, right? A lot of people bring up meritocracy, or they have to prove themselves. Or this is a really bad way to think. I know that sounds that sounds awkward, but here's the issue. It's because the general problem with political authority in the liberal world and uh, stemming from like from proto liberalism and absolutism, if we want to go all the way back to like the 16th century and the 15th century, and people like Thomas Hobbes, is when we're justifying political legitimacy in this way, we're making it about the person, right? About a charismatic man or something, someone who just like, or someone who's adhering to the rules. And if the man adheres to the rules and they have the merit to perform it well, then they should have office. I disagree. What I think matters more is why people are offended at, for example, you remember those TikTok videos of like nurses and military and police dancing?
Yeah.
There's a reason this pisses people off. They don't understand why, but there's a good reason for it. Same thing when you have your local priests and they try to be like hip and cool, and it just comes off really stupid and fake, because we have an intrinsic sense of what a symbolic role should mean, like what an office should mean. Kind of like we have, the office of the chair of St. Peter for the Pope. We respect the office. It's not about always adhering to the person or liking everything they say. It's that we respect the office because it has a meaning which is higher than the person occupying it. So we're saying the symbolic role of the politician or the guy in the military, the policeman, we're not basing it on their performance. I mean, that is something that matters, but it has to be secondary. What has to matter is that role requires a burden on the person, because the burden is trying to live up to what that role means. This is why symbolic value matters. And this is why, you'll see people mock, say, the Queen's Guard, like tourists that come from America. Like, what is this? Is this like Disneyland? This is so stupid. Because they have a sense of symbolic authority, and that's why they have so much discipline, because they're trying to live up to something other than themselves. But we always tend to make it about ourselves. And same thing with the right and reactionary thinking. It's like, oh, well, you have the charisma. Do you have the strength to do this job? Do you have the merits? And well, those things don't fucking matter. What matters is what is the meaning of the office you're trying to aspire to. And we're simply never going to escape that liberal mode of thinking unless that is drilled into people's heads. It's about living up to something other, right? It's the same reason people that are traditional Catholic, they get upset at a lot of newer priests, and they want the priest to stop listening to them, and they want to be like, tell us what to do, because we respect you. We know that you're different. We have the sense that we want people in these positions to be different. If you're like a poor kid, for example, you're going to university or something, or you're trying to get into university, you're a poor kid, you meet someone who's in the discipline you want to be in, and you want to aspire to be like him, and you want to get his help on your side. And you go to talk to him and you want, like, okay, give me all you know about this particular trade that I want to get into, or this particular field, or whatever. You don't want him to be like, I'm just like you.
Yeah.
No, you don't. You want to aspire to him. You want to become something respectable. We make it all about ourselves, but ourselves is essentially a vapid whole. There is no internal self without relation to the world, and there is no relation to the world without relation to the cultural milieu, and then no relation of that to the environment of the natural world. We really got to drill that message in.
It's like, I know, I believe it was Spengler who said that one of my favorite things. I always get to mix up with Evola because they had a lot of overlap in some of their works, but he was talking about how as a civilization falls, things don't become destroyed, they become inverted. And so you could imagine in an ideal world, you would have a great man who is humble. And that's kind of what people seem to like. They like someone of great stature, but is not pompous. But that's become so inverted that we have someone who is arrogant, but does this sort of, I'm using the word performative a lot, but performative humbleness. And that's what you get with regular politicians. You have these ivory tower, elitist, could not be further away from the people, but then doing a photo op, kissing a turkey, doing things that don't make any sense. And everyone knows this is wrong. Everyone feels like this is wrong because what they're responding to, I think is what you're getting at, is that the office itself doesn't make any sense. Everything's inverted, but logically nothing follows. And so we're in this constant state of unease looking at these things that used to hold symbolic power just turn into a dead circus.
Yeah, like the politician should recognize his job as a burden, not as like I don't remember who said this or where this came from. Maybe it was Murdoch. But it's like the king or the leader should come in and then they should retire to the farm after once the war is over. Like the idea here is that it's what needs to be done or what needs to be lived up to. This symbolic sense of burden that comes with leadership. It's not something where you'd be like Pelosi or Biden, where you've been at it for fucking years. Embarrassment aside, like you're more of a celebrity rather than anyone trying to fulfill something.
Or even worse, you see yourself as a main character in the show of politics.
Isn't that what they call themselves now? Protagonists?
Yeah, we're protagonists in American politics. Like, us, like there's no real fundamental difference between them and any sort of, I don't even want to call them bureaucrats, because a bureaucrat you could serve a function. But it's, everyone might be, sometimes people roll their eyes just complaining about politicians, but it is important that, the politicians ought to serve some kind of higher symbolic value. And I think most people, you cannot serve a symbolic value if what you are there to do is change things. That might be a broad reaching comment. I can understand that. But, if you've built, and this could be an argument that the entire system is built to collapse, which fair enough. But if the entire thing every politician wants to go there to change things, preferably within their first year, they actually don't go in to ever want to serve anything except this vague idea of the people, which they don't even seem to truly adhere to. But that's why, we could look at the current political system we have as a complete and total inversion of what it ought to be. And what I was thinking about this the other day, because I take in a fairly broad spectrum of content. And I just sat back there and I'm like, it's funny how nobody's happy. No one in America or Canada is happy at the way things are. Liberals, especially. Liberals have pretty much gotten everything they've ever wanted, and they're not happy. And it's like, and they will say, oh, this is just how society is. I'm like, I don't think so. I think it's a unique, of the moment thing to have this highly advanced civilization and everyone's miserable and everyone wants it to end in some way or the other. That sounds like a crazy way to live. And I think that can be blamed on some of these really fundamental paradigm collapses, if we can call them that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also liked what you said there, and this is where we can get into phenomenology, where you had, and I'd heard you made this critique before, and I like it, because we had covered on the show de Juvenel. We've covered a lot of the NRX thinkers, and we like talking about power centralization and all that stuff. We talking about national sovereignty and things like that. But it is interesting how in our scene there are some people who are still looking for that magic golden ticket of ignore everything else, pay attention to this. So the popular thing right now, and I do like a lot of it, I just think it doesn't explain everything, is talk about how power functions as if it is an entity in itself. But I'd gotten some pushback because while I think that can explain a lot of things and explain how certain mechanisms operate, I'm like, there needs to be some kind of animating force behind it, because I'll hear this all the time in a lot of our communities that we are post ideology, we're post everything, almost as sort of a new left Marxist critique that believe, and maybe this comes out of the cathedral thing from Curtis Yarvin, where it's like all that is, which is really just an adoption of the Marxist point of view, that everything is part of this superstructure. Ideology doesn't exist. It's all materialism. It's all economics. We don't need to go down that whole thing. But where a lot of people have to grapple with the fact that it's like, well, there is some kind of animating force behind things, so there has to be. And this is why I truly think a lot of Marxist critiques fall short, because they keep hitting this wall. That not everything is materialistic, not everything is just economics and markets. So, and I think that's where we kind of get into your thing, which is, if I am correct, and maybe I'm completely mistaken, because while I am a galaxy brain, it's a galaxy far, far away. So I might have the wrong read on phenomenology, but my understanding of a phenomenology, which you're obviously the expert on, is trying to bridge that gap of not just separating the materialistic from the spiritual, but kind of explaining, exploring where those meet, and understanding that there is a connection between the materialistic and the metaphysical. Is that an accurate overview?
I'll try to do this a bit differently than I normally do when it comes to explaining phenomenology. It's always good when I get to go on other shows because I don't have to explain like minute to various texts, so I get to do it in a more audience friendly way. So, how I'll start this is it does make its way to marrying the material and the metaphysical, but that comes a bit later. Phenomenology in the first place is descriptive originally. So the word phenomenology just means it's a combination of phenomena and logos. So it's basically about describing how things appear to consciousness. Now, this is not meant in like an introspective way. This is not like, oh, I'm writing a poem on how sad I feel, and you describe what it means to feel sad or be dumped. It's not really what it's like, right? It's not introspection. What phenomenology is, and originally it was actually meant to safeguard mathematics and science from skepticism and from relativism, but also from misunderstanding itself too and being caught in false standards of objectivity that it doesn't deserve. So it was originally trying to safeguard that practice of Western philosophy and the essentially you could say the torch of truth as held by Europeans, at least if you're Husserl. So how that proceeds then is by a method of description where you'll look at how something that we take for granted is taken in a very abstract way, and then we form our understanding based on that abstraction, and then we allow it to infect how we think about ourselves and how we naturally move in the world and what have you. So in short, our self-understanding ends up coming out from our own abstractions. So what the work of phenomenology is to do is to clear those misunderstandings out of the way by returning to how our experiences are originally constituted in consciousness. So a good easy example is let's talk about fMRI, right? So brain scans. So everyone in the audience has seen this before. You'll turn on the TV, you'll go on YouTube, you'll see an article from like I fucking love science, and it'll say something like, "We've discovered where love is in the brain. We've discovered where hatred is in the brain. We've discovered where jealousy is in the brain."
Or sometimes they'll say we've discovered where God lives in the brain, and it's actually the thing that controls your erection. Like weird shit like that sometimes too.
100%. Now, the way in which to carry this out is the way the fMRI scanning works is it essentially measures the movement of oxygen to neurons, right? And neural activity happens in milliseconds, while the deliverance of oxygen is about 2 to 10 seconds. So it lags behind. So we're essentially measuring this. So that's the part that actually lights up. So we represented this very simplistic view that it's just a matter of hooking someone up to a scan, handing them a picture of their loved one, and seeing what lights up. But in actuality, millions of neurons are also activated that don't appear on the scan. Say some that are linking to other regions in the brain, for example, things that are underrepresented, neural activity that doesn't require as much oxygen. So the whole premise of it's flawed to begin with. It's essentially trying to engage in a form of voodoo, where you just have this very simplistic one-to-one relation. But even the methodology itself has all kinds of problems. But when we get to the phenomenological level, even if we tighten up our instruments by looking into the brain, we find that this doesn't hold up either. And the reason is because we're going to engage in a phenomenological description. We're going to say, well, what is it actually, how is something an experience like love actually lived out in the world? Well, anyone who's been in love knows that it's not like a single state. So the idea behind those kind of neuroscientific studies is that it's a single state in the brain housed in one area and it's represented, right? So it's called representationalism. It's the idea that the brain produces representations of the world because it receives stimuli passively, and then it gets represented by the brain. So you don't have any direct engagement with the world. That's the idea there. So what we know then from phenomenology is we're going to describe how that's actually lived out in the world, and it's not a single state. It's an enduring state, right? Often you go through all different kinds of modalities, jealousy, desire, very complicated feelings rise up, feelings of frustration with trying to focus on your work, all different kinds of things that actually go into that experience. They're all lived out in the world. They're all lived out in temporality. They're not lived out in single states, which can be cut out and then put under a lab, right? And so the issue then is that kind of scientific paradigm is it treats people like they're passive respondents to stimuli, and that their brains are computers that represent the world around them. And then they go on to construct experiments based on that. And then they discover that people are passive receptors to stimuli, and that their brain houses representations. So they end up in this kind of circle of self-confirmation. And so the phenomenologist is going to step in and describe what our conscious experience of being in the world is actually like. Not to be like, fuck science, but rather we can fix our scientific endeavors with a more realistic understanding of what it actually means to be human. So phenomenology actually proceeds from first that descriptive level. So I'll just stop if you want to ask anything before I keep going.
Well, I was just going to say this touches on some things we discussed recently on the show that kind of build on this idea, because even there's aspects of the scientific world that have kind of they've caught on to this. So one thing that came to mind was we covered the book by Norbert Wiener, who was one of the pioneers of cybernetics. And the topology of the brain is right at the forefront of the mind of most people deal with cybernetics. And when they describe, some people hear that and they think, oh, we can create a human mind with a computer. It's like, well, a lot of the time they don't really understand much about the human brain. So one example would be, we can map neurons in a way to binary code because it's kind of like on-off switches, sure, whatever. But there's a part of the brain that they really had to try to work with, which is there is a part of the brain that does handle abstract concepts, and we don't that's kind of a black box of the brain. And there might be some scientists who hear that who get mad at me, but I think it is true that they're like, okay, there are parts of the brain that don't just respond to stimuli. There is this big chunk of a cluster of neurons in our brain that is only there to work through abstract concepts and to be comparing the past to the present, and it's only there to try and think about things like love, like spiritual, like God on a higher level. We don't really know how it works, but even evolutionarily, we have decided that that's important. So I would argue that even the scientists who have been trying to drag this down into this sort of materialistic, we are just receivers of information, they are not scientific at all. And this is where I've done this in other episodes where you get into information theory. And the more you learn about information theory, the more you drill down into the quantum world, the more you realize that, oh, there is almost something like magic going on, because when they describe information, it's like, oh, it's just, it's the matter of the universe just does what it wants to do. I'm like, well, that almost sounds like a Schopenhauer will sort of thing, which you would scoff at the rest of the time. But once you talk about we're getting back to the animating forces behind the real world, which is kind of what I was so interested in. Anyway, that's more of just trying to make a couple tangents on there that I think do build up where you're coming from and make it not only spiritually relevant, but scientifically relevant. But I digress.
Yeah, well, it's good you bring it up, because part of the issue with that kind of localization brain theory is the very ideas that we try to find in the brain. They're not derived from the brain in like a subject-object way, like a brain receiving and building the world in its head and representations. They're completely inseparable from how we actually live out in the world. Like, take, for example, the evolutionary development of our thumbs, right? Like something like a simple, like, you don't have to, when people try to defend consciousness from materialist reductionism, they tend to say things, well, like, look at a human making classical music or great poetry. And I say in response, You don't even have to point to those things. You can point to the lowest levels of human consciousness by, say, for example, non-opposable thumbs. The creation of a spear by like prehistoric man is like 300 steps compared to like a monkey, which can do all kinds of complicated tasks by their own standards. But even then, that's quite minuscule compared to the lowest level of human consciousness. And that's not a spooky point. It's the fact that we have a certain evolutionary structure that engages with the world in a certain way. And the consciousness doesn't develop independently of that. Right? It's lived out in the world. But now we can take another example of how our cultural construction actually largely shapes consciousness. So a very basic example is how we eat, right? We, again, simple phenomenon. We don't need to go to poetry. We don't need to go to high capacity that humans are capable of. I mean, we make things look nice on plates. We have meeting times which we're going to eat, right? We go through, but essentially, if you compare it to the rest of the animal world, they're very elaborate rituals. And so what I'm getting at here is that part of the point of what phenomenology is telling us is that consciousness is not something merely in the head. Now, this is also an attack on substance dualism, too, which is the idea that you have an independent, immaterial soul that's essentially like a ghost in a machine. So like the Cartesian idea, I think, therefore I am. So one thing that both often religious defenders and materialist reductionists have in common is they try to localize consciousness to, say, a seat in the brain or an immaterial soul. What do you end up with? You end up with a subject-object problem of how does that particular transcendence, and I mean that in a technical term, as in that which constitutes your experience of the world, not in a religious sense. How does that actually interact with the world out there? You end up with this irreconcilable subject-object problem. So something what we would term cognitive neo-Kantianism in today's brain sciences is it's like, okay, well, you're a passive receptor to stimuli. The brain creates representations. So you never actually have any direct experience of the world. The brain shapes your experience of the world for you, which is basically the same thing as the dualist would say, or the Kantian would say, only they'd be talking about like an ineffable subject or soul. So they both have these same problems. Now, so the phenomenologist is going to, if we're translating into scientific terms, which it has been done, it's a newer paradigm called embodied cognition, which is that the consciousness is not just the brain or the body or the environment. Rather, it's the relation between them. Essentially, there is no subject-object dichotomy in an epistemological sense in which you'd have a problem. It's rather the relation itself that matters. And so what consciousness is it's this complex play of brain, body, environment, the intersubjective community, the cultural world, the extension of consciousness, like the way you use technology becomes a part of consciousness. And it comes back and it influences us just as much as we influence it. So we're not saying that there's no genetic component or there's no brain component or that these things don't matter. Rather, we're saying that it's never a causal one-to-one relation, but it's this complex interdependence that actually has consequences for the choices that we make and how we go about living in the world, which also looks back and affects us. So a very simple way to understand this is what I call passive transhumanism. Because people talk about transhumanism, they always mean like some fancy thing, like your brain gets uploaded into a computer.
Right.
Which is nonsense, of course, because consciousness is temporality. You can't upload temporality.
Yeah.
You have to isolate a single state, but consciousness is a temporal stream, essentially. It's this movement in which there's no present. It's past, present, and future, which makes up the experience of what we call a now. So I kind of lost where I was going with that. No, so yeah. So what I was getting at is I totally lost where I was going.
Oh no! Well, that's a very interesting thing because this does line up with a lot of things we were talking about like the idea of this is a problem, and I've said this before on the show, so I apologize people have heard this before, but I do think it's important to say that this is the exact problem they ran into when trying to create artificial intelligence, that they found they hit a really low ceiling in creating AI because they realized that to create a proper AI that is something like we would recognize as artificial intelligence, it needed to have a physical form. That it need because so much of how we define ourselves as a human entity is the fact that we exist in the world with two arms and two legs, and we have these very specific sensory inputs, and we not only that but our interaction with the world and the night and the day and everything. So unless they could give artificial intelligence some kind of form, and this is where you get Boston Dynamics, this is where you get all these horrific visual representations of this is what robots will look like, and they all look bad, but they need it, otherwise it literally doesn't work. And just on that, this will be a little bit of an aside, but something I wanted to cover on the show, I didn't know how to do it, but when I would read about the occult, I found this very interesting about, and it'd be very, let's say, reductive, it'd be very kind of feeling its way in the dark, but there was this idea that the entirety of the human body was relevant. That I was reading this book, it was about like the Christ, what was it called? Something about the body of the anatomy, and it was like if you look at these old kind of alchemical and all these old ancient things, there's this idea that a certain part of you is housed in your foot, and here's what your foot represents and your hand represents, and this is kind of where you get acupuncture too. The point being that your entire being is also in your entire body, and that has some kind of relevance to the rest of the world, because they started noticing like, wow, there's certain patterns in how we think and how we look with how the world looks. So there's always this interplay throughout time of us trying to figure out how our consciousness fits. It kind of goes across our entire body, but also interacts with the world. And again, these might have been inelegantly done, but it seems sort of like a novel modern take to believe that like, oh, your consciousness is just your mind. It lives in the top of your head, and we can pluck it out and put it over here, and everything else is just a machine. And maybe this is where you get a ghost in the machine and stuff like that. But anyway, I just thought it was fascinating, the parallels that this sort of thing it had with other things we had talked about.
Yeah,
did that jog anything?
Oh no, there's a lot to respond to there, but I remember where I was going with that. I was talking about the more passive, softer transhumanism.
Oh yes,
I totally lost that point where I was going with that, but now I remember, because I was talking about how, for example, we tend to imagine transhumanism in that very elegant kind of way, that very like sci-fi kind of way, which a lot of transhumanists aspire to.
Even our cyberpunk, the dystopian ones, we still kind of like, because we try and make it as cool as possible.
Yeah, we all love that point and click Blade Runner game.
Yeah,
but yeah. So, but essentially, we already do inhabit a kind of soft transhumanism, in the sense that we're always so plugged into technological modes of being where we don't have work that is, for example, embodied often, right? It's very like the creative self-entrepreneur, the one who markets himself on Instagram or something, or your boss who wants to be your friend, or always working from home, always sitting down. Now, why are these things so unhealthy? Well, because we're embodied beings. We're meant to be living out and creating and cultivating with the world around us. That's who we are. Right, healthy consciousness requires the body. This is something that St. Thomas Aquinas knew already. The soul is the form of the body. You're not wholly a person if you're not inhabiting a body, if you're not inhabiting a world, which again, dualists, substance dualists of the religious variety don't seem to get. The Christian message isn't about an immaterial soul. And so
that's interesting. A lot of people might find that surprising if you wanted to kind of set up camp there and explain that, or we can keep going with the larger soft transhumanism one too.
Well, I'll wrap up the Aquinas stuff when we get to the end of explaining, because that's when we get from the materials of the metaphysical. But so basically, we're very unhealthy. But if the representationalist view of consciousness were correct, none of that should be an issue. We're representing the world around us. It's essentially a kind of passive solipsism. But it is deeply unhealthy, because our body matters. The world we live in matters. And this is not just related to physiological capacity, right? It's also the fact that, the cities that you live in, if they're ugly, that's going to have an impact on our consciousness, because these things are related, they interact, and they affect each other in ways which often escape our grasp. And so this view of consciousness, I think, is the more realistic one, the more accurate one.
I agree with that, and I bet if you were to explain that as simply as you did, because I was very, very brought down to a guy like old chunk of coal like me can understand. But if I were to explain that to your average person on the street, give the example of someone in my family, I bet that's never occurred to them. So ingrained in their day to day life is this belief that their mind is this sort of ethereal ghost like thing that can separate from its body. And this might be very much reinforced by the media and the stories we tell each other. But this idea, like, that sounds like it makes sense. But I don't think most people, even if they're 50 years old, have never heard that before. And that would so change how they would interact with the real world.
Oh, I was muted. I didn't notice.
Oh, sorry.
I was saying that's very well said, because the mark of good phenomenology, because phenomenology, when you're talking about the method and the philosophy behind it, it's extremely technical, because you're engaging against other disciplines. You're trying to clarify your own. But when you're doing phenomenology and you explain it to someone who's, doesn't have to be a philosopher, you can take a simple example and be like, the way in which you're playing baseball and you go to catch the ball, you don't have a theoretical representational relationship to the ball where you calculate where it's going to land and then you go and do it accordingly. Your body, you simply move with it. You have that intuitive understanding of familiarity with the world. And hearing that, you'd be like, yeah, that's obvious. And it should be. But the point is the way in which we carry out our self-understanding, phenomenologists will call it sedimented, is that they'll have these layers of unexamined metaphysics, which we then put into our science, which then we construct experiments around it, and we end up missing those essential components of what makes humanity human. And so the more a phenomenologist engages in the practice, they should be able to describe things. And I don't mean just like things about the body. I mean things about our deepest experiences. If you read something like Levinas's work, Totality and Infinity, it's beautiful. It's like a work of poetry. There's instances in which you almost want to bawl reading some of that stuff, even though I disagree fundamentally with this whole premise. But it's about that lived experience which we move in, we have familiarity with. And it gets lost, though, in our politics and our media and the way in which we try to understand the human, and then we end up creating a subject which again is a political one, right? It's integrating someone into a certain system. Like, one way in which this is done is behavioral economics. They take over from evolutionary psychology. They say the reason that people are attracted to subprime mortgages is because something all the way back in their evolutionary past, and then we miss obvious dimensions. But that becomes a method of political control and integration as an economic unit, and these things actually affect policy. So phenomenology is also a very crucial practice, right? And like another way you could remind people of like how this makes sense to their everyday experience is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, one of the main guys of embodied phenomenology. He talked about phantom limb syndrome, and he goes through how it can't purely be explained physiologically, even though it has physiological components, and how it can't be purely explained psychologically, even though it has psychological components, because effectively the patient with phantom limb syndrome is they're trying to navigate their function and familiarity with the world, which they don't want to lose, right? That's their engagement with the world. We're always bound up with the world in that way. And so when we do phenomenology, it should sound like common sense to a person. And then that person should be like, oh, well, why am I buying all this bullshit I'm being fed to me?
What I like about this is maybe and this might be too reductive, but it's like this concept of permanence. Now, some people might think this sounds unfair or uncharitable, but I do get the sense the more I learn about Eastern religion, Eastern spirituality, not culture necessarily, but Eastern spirituality, I find that there's a common thread of almost treating the physical world as trivial. And I see this a bit in Indian, but also in Chinese ancient beliefs, that, there is more of the idea that you can separate spiritually. Maybe I'm wrong on this. I'm open to being corrected on this. But in Eastern, Eastern religions, Eastern spirituality, there's this idea that, there's all these past lives and future lives. This is just one experience. It doesn't really matter. And I find that Western religions, specifically Christianity, get dinged for that. They get accused of being that. But upon further inspection, that's not really the case. That this idea of your physical form being not just something you can separate from and go to heaven if you actually read the books and the theology, that's unique to maybe a Western identity. And, we can go in the weeds on this a little bit, because early on the show, we discussed one of those, we got into all that, like, Atlantean, Hyperborean type stuff, and reading Rene Guénon and these other thinkers. And some of it gets really kooky, but there's some really interesting stuff there. And one of the things that a lot of these very serious, scientifically minded people notice, that in Western culture versus Eastern culture, there is this commonality of the fallen state, that things used to be better or perhaps even perfect in the past, and they're worse now. Whereas in Indian culture and in Buddhism, and it's sort of this constant stasis, but that changes our entire worldview. And so I find, even in that sense, and perhaps this is why Christianity was so popular to the European, that's my own little hypothesis. I haven't developed it that much, but it's something. This idea that things can change forever, that things can get worse. It's not just a game. It's not just frivolous, that there's more permanence to life and our actions, and we can, over time, that I see somewhat missing in the Eastern spirituality. And again, maybe I'm completely wrong on that, but even within, like, the Hyperborean stuff, including Christianity, including all the other stuff, there is that echo that is not, I don't see elsewhere. Anyway, I just wanted to go on that little tangent for a second. Does that sound like anything that makes sense to you?
I actually agree. I actually spent a lot of time during my undergrad with Buddhist monks, because I ended up doing some Eastern religion class, and one of my projects was, I chose basically spending time with Buddhist monks and then writing an evaluation of the experience.
You led a very cool life, by the way. I just want to establish that right now.
Thank you. Seems kind of like a movie sometimes, but the weird.
Yeah, you're just the karate philosopher. No big deal.
Yeah, it's a lot to live up to. But so, like, maybe like in Hinduism, for example, you have probably a lot more closeness with the European in that way, because you have like a caste system, you have the cycle, and you have dharma. But in Buddhism, anyways, it's this kind of escape from all that, right? It's that you have to break the cycle, that the world of attachments is a world of samsara, it's a world of illusion. So the goal is nirvana. It's essentially to extinguish that. And so the practices are aimed at trying to not, like, think about anything and cultivate this attachment, like Nietzsche would say. In one instance, I agree with him, like, with kind of like Buddhists are kind of like cows on the field, right? And yeah. So I agree with that entirely. And again, this ties back to what I was saying earlier. There's a reason why that kind of Eastern spirituality is so popular among, like, Google and Apple. you can do the most horrific things on the world. You can cultivate a kind of sense that, it doesn't really matter.
Well, I remember my priest had pointed that out years and years ago. He had made a comment, just an offhand comment, that Buddhism was an atheist religion, which you don't really hear in the zeitgeist like that. But it was, and I was old enough to know what that meant, but I never heard it before. And you always think, it's like every time I would hear an atheist talk, I always give the example of Sam Harris and maybe Richard Dawkins, but they had nothing but scorn for Christianity, double scorn for Islam, which made them kind of popular on the right for a while. But then also they loved Eastern spirituality. And I'm like, well, that's funny, because I guess it must not, they like it because it doesn't actually fill the criteria of a religion, And so the same thing happened with the tech companies and these CEOs, and maybe they're just following the trends or whatever, but it's funny how it finds such a home and an open acceptance, even an encouragement in Silicon Valley or the whatever the analogous thing is up here in Canada, McMaster University, some bullshit. Certainly not Toronto, but they love it, but it's still vaguely understood. We get back to that like fortune cookie martial art thing where I'm kind of just acting vaguely Japanese. I'm wearing wooden sandals, and you ask them why. It's like, well, it's Cobra Kai. That's what you do. It's just this thing that happens that no one questions, but all the wrong people love it. If I were
Yeah.
Buddhist, if I were Buddhist, maybe I'd be pissed off. But the fact that more Buddhists aren't pissed off is odd to me. I thought that the other day. I'm like, do you think any of these Eastern spiritual people are at all aggrieved by this? Because it seems like they're not, and that is troubling in itself.
There's not much Buddhist monks lighting themselves on fire in North America, but like they used to during the Vietnam War. But yeah, it's interesting. But to widen our scope a little, because you said a lot of interesting stuff that I got to respond to stuff earlier. You mentioned like this kind of Marxist idea, like things are superstructure tied back to a material base, so they emanate from that. So like one to widen our scope of phenomenology a bit, to explain this more to the audience, it's not just about things like neuroscience. The scope of phenomenology is basically everything. And so one way which we're particularly mystified by things is, say, the economy. Now, this is something that infects the right too. Like, you notice how we talk about like what would be our approach to the economy. We tend to think about things like what policy, where would we give money, where would we put our monetary value, these kinds of things. The issue is that how we conceive of economy itself never comes into the picture. And so a good phenomenologist, they're going to look to, say, for example, and this is something we talk about a lot, not on EBL, but Theopolitics, was the way in which the transformation of the market under absolutism and the so-called falsely named religious wars. Whereas there's this desacralization of the market as a place of gift exchange, which was the Christian notion of market. So you have essentially notions of just distribution. And you read a lot of the early economists and political economists, like Adam Smith, Ricardo, all these kinds of guys. We tend to imagine, and they do this the same way that scientists do with computational views of the brain, that they're describing the economy as essentially a realm of nature in which you can understand its laws like a science, and you can think of it like a science. Now, but you go and you read those texts, and you find something very different. You find a mix of Milbank calls a mixture of heterodox Christianity and pagan agonism. Because you read, for example, like Smith in that. The idea here is that humans are essentially have different wills. They're rational self-interest calculators that are at odds with each other. So you have this internal tension, this internal agonism, this internal conflict between different interests. And someone thinking about that, the astute observer, is going to be like, well, interesting. This is just a liberal philosophy of what the human is. This is Thomas Hobbes, right? This is a kind of pagan agonism of war of all against all. But then you also have a heterodox Christian theology, because the solution to this pagan agonism, this notion of liberal rights and internal conflict between people, is essentially a theodicy stripped of its Christian meaning, because you have the movement of the invisible hand that provides an outcome to this self-interest, which is a cohesive whole. And so you look at the early economists and you discover, well, this isn't really a pure science. They're creating a scientific area. They're creating something that we think of as economy. And then they're creating these, affirming these abstract laws are there, and then they go about to understand it. So they create this new realm of scientific endeavor. They give it the label of objectivity, and then they proceed to move within that. And then you get the whole history of political economy. So then the value of, say, economics and social science is not that we're trying to understand a permanent scientific realm of the human condition. Rather, I would say the only value for it is you're trying to understand the current cultural milieu that you live in. But nonetheless, those are constructions, but they're constructions that we live by. But the general revolutionary move is not to just say, where would we give money? How would we organize this? It's the question of how we conceive of economy itself. And the good phenomenologist will then see how that came about in history. But we're not deconstructionists either. We're not just saying it's all fake. We could just all whatever, freedom. Rather, we're saying that there are components of the human, its relation to God, ourselves, the body, the environment, that there is better forms of flourishing. We can counter narrate it. So we're not deconstructionists either. But we can actually critique the whole understanding that comes with liberalism, which is something NRX can't do because it operates within the very same parameters of these modern self-understanding, these kind of Hobbesian power theories, right? Just similar to the way political economy developed.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff because it falls within this sort of liberal worldview, and we cover this in depth if anyone's wondering on an episode and a clip where discussed the end of history and the last man, this idea that everything is constant progress and that everything that came before is by its nature inferior to what we have now. But, so there's this idea when it comes to economics, and economists are terrible at this because if you look at the history of market speculation, and we also covered this a while ago about the history of the book Devil Take the Hindmost, that prior to every crash, everyone thought they had solved economics. They had solved this problem. They made the perfect machine where these collapses wouldn't happen. And I think we always come back to, we're just trying to perfect this engine called economics in itself. And once we perfect that engine, not only will it not cause any suffering, but it will handle all the distribution of everything. And so once again, we come back to what we talked about before, that there is no, if you're ignoring the animating force behind things. And this is kind of what I liked about Marxists, was that they would dare to look at this machine and say, let's just think of a new fucking thing. Let's just reinvent this. What are we doing here? What do we actually do? And so they took one more materialistic pathway and the labor theory of value. And there's a lot of good fire in that engine, I think, that was, trying to get to the roots of the problem. I just don't really believe the prescriptions, but, this idea of looking at the economy and saying, what is this thing? Is it serving its purpose? What is the purpose we want it to have? And look to the past, not as this problem we solve, but there's a lot of wisdom that maybe we just forgot.
Yeah, absolutely. Right on. And I want to hit the Marxists in a bit here, but
go ahead.
just to bring this to the NRX scene is,
and just to clarify for people, NRX, we've talked about this on the show before. Of people don't know NRX, they're not around a lot much anymore, but they still kind of have a different name. Neo-reactionaries. We're talking about a lot of the Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbugs, some various other people. So if people want to know more about that, they can go look at that. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I'd say they still have a pretty endearing influence too, like the post-NRX scene.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you this: Mencius Moldbug publishes a post, and everyone's talking about it. So some people hate me when I say he's still like a towering figure in the scene. Even if people hate him, he says something, and everyone's got to have a take. You know what I mean? But sorry, continue.
Yeah, and so I mean, like the NRX, I'm always been completely opposed to. I do wonder why people got so swindled by it. I mean, if you have a guy telling you that the name for the superstructure of the system is the cathedral, and what we need is a CEO, then you have to raise some eyebrows.
Yeah,
that complete backwards description, at least terms of terms are being chosen. But it basically falls in the same category of social science. Now, social science is entirely bullshit. Now, when I say that, I don't mean like empirical studies in the sense like, X people does this happens. We carry out a study of some social scientific study. I'm talking about the philosophical presumptions of early social science, like through Weber and these sort of Weber, Durkheim, all these kinds of guys. And it stems out of early liberal theory, right? It stems out of Thomas Hobbes. It stems out of power analysis. And so this move, which gets back to what we were saying earlier, is you tend to see people say, well, power does this, power does that. And what you find common in NRX is it doesn't question the system. It actually tries to adjust you to it by making it better. Like when the Moldbugs, or more humane or more formalized, to be exact, right? If we formalize power, we kind of know what's going on. There we go. Like we see that with Moldbug's recent posts, like, you people in this and right, it needs to be the elites. We're the ones that are going to carry this out because of my essentialist view of power, basically. So it's basically power does this, power does that. And so to understand this and why it's thoroughly modern, it's completely silly to adopt it as one of our philosophical presuppositions for the dissonant right, is it engages in this very early social science project where everything is some kind of emanation of power in a metaphysical sense. And so the German social scientists, and they took over from people like de Maistre, a lot of the French Catholic reactionaries. So this might sound kind of odd, but the French Catholic reactionaries were the basis for German social science because they essentially said, well, the social is where God's plan fulfills itself. And so if you tweak the social, you're acting in concordance with God. So you have to understand these social divine laws, say like the monarchy. And so Auguste Comte comes along, one of the first social scientists, and he goes, well, you don't need that. If all of our religious self-understanding is simply mechanisms of the social, the way in which it regulates itself, then we just need to understand the social. Mm-hmm. And so this is where you get theories, and people on the right, they still talk like this. They say like, you need a monotheism because it's better to have a king, and a monarchy generates a monotheism, one king, one God, right? Or the other way around, one God, you have one king.
Yeah.
And so our social systems our religious self-understanding, these are emanations stemming from the power structure, which then you tweak the power structure, you get a different kind of result. But all these things, we can essentially control it like a science because we understand that these are really mechanisms of power. This is the social. The problem is that's completely circular, right? It's like, well, religion is really society and society is really religion. You essentially can't go anywhere with that. Like you look at the medieval towns, for example, the reason that they had guild systems was not because, okay, well, their Christian justification came after the fact. It's because they inhabited a Christian worldview that produced a certain kind of economic self-understanding, which was never reducible to just the religious or the social, but rather it's a very complex interplay of them. And so these kinds of mechanisms of power in the social, they only appear within a higher symbolic self-understanding. But what the real problem is if we follow that kind of NRX power theory, is we essentially take facets of liberalism and we make it a permanent facet of the human condition, that these structures are essentially always going to be there. That it's simply you tweak it one way or the other, but this is the essential node of the human condition. And that is incredibly self-defeating.
It is. And I find that a lot of people have got to that point in various different ways, because I hear a lot of critiques towards the cathedral model. If people have heard that before, you can look it up. Basically, it's not much different than a straight up Marxist interpretation of society, because the Marxists, we were reading Louise Althusser on ideology, and I think you might cover that too. It's an interesting book, but in a lot of ways, a lot of the Marxists kind of they have that belief that everything is just this giant superstructure that feeds and justifies itself. And I found that a lot of people had accused Moldbug of just being this post-left, hidden Marxist, and it's hard to disagree with that when I see that. I heard he was on a podcast with this woman, Alex Kashuta, and he was giving a prescription for what we should do to be a dissident in this system. And his prescription was essentially to fly under the radar, don't cause any problems, just work on your little projects and don't rock the boat so you don't bring any attention to yourself. And I would say, well, that sounds like an idea from someone who kind of likes it the way it is. Like, I don't understand how you're supposed to be king dissident. You're supposed to be king critiquer of the system, but everything you have said is how to reinforce the system or live in its shadows quietly. And I heard that, I'm like, oh, okay, I don't really know what you're supposed to be suggesting here, other than to not use the word de-radicalize, but to just take the fangs out of any fucking idea you have. But anyway, that's just what I had heard. And once I look at him, I see that, sorry, my wife was just waving to me there. She opened the door a little bit. I got distracted. She does that. She does that sometimes. I get distracted.
I've never actually watched her stuff before. But yeah, no, that's entirely true. And here I want to hit Marxism. Because a very common thing that you hear is that Christianity is the seed for the world we live in now, this kind of egalitarian world, which isn't really the case. It's not really egalitarian. But regardless, it's like this aspiration of like a universal humanity, right? Where everyone's sharing. And people say, well, that comes from Christianity. Well, let's look at that a little bit. In fact, this realm of pure nature, this realm of pure power, that is more responsible for why we are where we are today. So let's take a look at the Marxist, for example. People say, well, Marxism takes over from Christianity, this kind of egalitarian vision, but they're actually incredibly at odds with each other. I don't mean that in the common sense way that Marxists destroy churches. I mean at a deep philosophical level, they're completely at odds with each other. And that's because Marxism is based on German social science. So the idea here is the Comtean religious the religion of humanity, right? So remember I said earlier that the story that the modernists tell themselves is we were involved in primitive rituals, and then Christianity came along, and there was some kind of self-understanding and some self-criticism because, we move from many gods to one God, and then we move from that to understanding the social. And then from there, we can understand humanity. So this is the progressive story that social science has given us. And this is at the very heart of modernity. So what does the Marxist say? Well, the Marxist takes a look at, say, the superstructure. They want to explain away why the alienation of labor produces this kind of ideology, this kind of ideological mystification. And the story they tell is not at all like the Christian one. And in fact, the story they tell is more similar to the kind of pure humanity, pure nature story. And so essentially what he says is, Marx says we can think of the commodity in the same way that the early tribes, when they first became mystified by religion. So the story he tells us is from German social science. It's the idea that humanity was originally ingrained into nature. We had a one-to-one relationship with nature where there was no symbolic mystification in our language. We simply expressed the natural world around us, and we were therefore free. 1 second here. Let's take a drink of water.
Oh, go ahead.
And the story basically goes that the priests took these depictions of the natural world on their ideographs or pictographs, and then they made it something that was signified, something that was above our common sense experience, and then they manipulated that. So instead of being emanations of our own free humanity, they are therefore actually they're treated like something that is over and above us, powers above us. And this is the beginning of ideological mystification for Marx. It starts there. So he's starting from a free humanity. Now, one thing I hear a lot, even in neo-pagan circles, is, we're trying to get past Christianity because we're trying to get to our realm of how we were originally free as European peoples with nature. The story they tell is the same as German social science. Of course, the problem with that is fairly obvious. We're always inhabiting within our language notions of symbolic value. It always escapes us necessarily. There's never any pure self-consciousness. It's always in some kind of transcendent framework. And even the early pagans, right? Their whole idea was, whether you be of the Platonic variety or the earlier varieties, that was still in notions of wrapped up in notions of the sacred that were not reducible to the social. And there were still notions of the sacred that they aspired to and that they lived in. It was never purely an expression of the human. So to bring this back to Marxism then, Marx hated the idea of the medieval guild, basically the idea as well as an excellent practitioner of his craft. Say you're like a woodworker and you conceive of everything you do as a devotion to God. So this is why you cultivate excellence. And Marx would look at that and say, well, this is the ideological mystification of the commodity. So we can't have guilds. We can't have the excellent worker. In fact, in the communist vision, everybody should be able to revolve around and do any other job that any other person can do. So the Marxist vision is to try to free humanity, to free this essential human nature, which is covered up by ideological mystification. And so the goal is you can't have these kinds of notions of excellence. And so the Marxist goal is not a criticism of economy. It's actually to make the economy more efficient so then people can pursue their free human nature. Now, that is more in line with the modern vision. In fact, it's completely opposed to the Christian understanding. It developed in opposition to Christianity. The Christian vision is that everything we do, as created in the image of God, it pertains to the divine. It pertains to the way in which we're created, that we're in a world that is it's creation. It's not merely nature. There's always a sacredness added. And so we're giving thanks in everything that we do. And so that there is difference between peoples. There's differences between projects we carry out. There's notions of the sacred, the good, the beautiful, that to lesser and lesser degrees you move towards or away from. Because the Christian view is that sin is negation. There's no evil in the sense of like an opposing force, but rather evil is colluding with your own dehumanization. It's falling into nothingness. So the Christian vision is a vision of genuine difference between peoples, between creation, between excellence. And so what the Christian aspires to is an economy which is a reflection of the image of God. It's not some kind of heavily bureaucratized, everyone can do anything, move them around, and then we can explore a free human nature. Rather, we find our being in creation, in which given to us, into which we're born. That includes our ethnos. That includes, basically all of our modes of self-expression. So those two worldviews could not be more completely at odds with each other. So when you see this kind of talk of like, this ideology or this is merely an emanation of some kind of material base, whether that be a Marxist variety or you can simply shift the terms to power if you're NRX, you're dealing with a thoroughly anti-Christian vision that in itself is constructed against Christianity.
That's fascinating stuff. And this is something, and I think we can probably end on that because it's a great point that ties everything together. Because what I found so fascinating about you specifically, and this is something I've taken a very keen interest in this year, especially, is that I see you're able to spin a lot of plates. So you're known in the circles for having an aptitude for philosophy, but then there's also the theology, and then there's also the political theory. I find it interesting. I find myself trying to do this more and more, of balancing all these things, because some people will commit just to one, that there is a synergy between the theological and the political and the philosophical, where some people think you need to be just one, or one defeats all of the others. And I referenced this book in a previous interview. I reference it more than I thought I would, because I didn't love the book when I read it, but it was Servium by Adrian Arcand, which is published by Antelope Hill, and we reviewed that on the show. But there were some things, it's really like 75% hating Jews, but at least within, I see a guy here, a Canadian guy, who's trying to reconcile fascism with Catholicism, just as an example. And he's pleading a case for that. And I find it interesting, people who are able to synergize things without revealing really any internal contradictions, as a Marxist might say. But I find it, do you think that is, A, do you think that's something you do? B, do you think that's something more people, if you do, ought to do?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes down to it, I do take theology to be the queen of the sciences for me. Mostly because, when you're a Catholic, then, theology basically gives you a view of the whole, right? Because you have an understanding of the cosmos, of who we're called to be. And in that sense, everything is subservient to that. But I also do think a good practitioner, a good thinker, they have to take into account the variety of modes of self-understanding that have been passed down to us and the kind of discourses that are out there. And I simply think that when you inhabit a new situation, you're dealing with new conditions. In that sense, you have to take on board philosophy, political theory. You have to wear many hats. And so I think that's something that more people should do.
Yeah, I see that we spoke with Mike from Imperium Press not long ago, and just to show the other side, the more pagan side, I see similar projects being enacted. And I think, he's not unfriendly towards Christians either, but this trying to take paganism, European paganism, and map it onto different forms, and to make it, if we can, summarize it this way, making it even more relevant and prescriptive and practical to the modern day. Whereas I think, and maybe you agree or disagree, but I think some people, when looking towards tradition, can get locked into the past and be somewhat anesthetized in the present by it.
Yeah, I think that's entirely true. And I think the other danger too is when you try to wear too many hats, but you don't actually commit to really mastering one. And I think that this can kind of end up in a hot take syndrome too. You go from one extreme to the other, or it's about generating the next clicks or the next hot take. So you never really settle into truly understanding something.
You fall into a worse form of economics, the economy of takes.
Yeah, exactly. And then what I notice with a lot of this is it's kind of an odd thing where you don't master when you don't master one particular discourse. You don't start from a method. You don't situate yourself. Then you end up actually more capable of being deceived. You go from one thing to the other. It's kind of like the very condition of modernity itself. When you're always surrounded by Snapchat, Instagram, all these different kind of identities, it evolves in a very consumer fashion. And so when you don't orient yourself, you end up in a position where you're going to miss key components, and you kind of move from one thing to the other, and then essentially you never really made any progress. And that's something I see quite common. And so it ends up manifesting itself and repeating a lot of the same theoretical discussions, which have been going on, before 2016 even. If we want to go back even further, we can say the German conservative revolution. You look at all the different groups that are around, they basically mirror our own dissident right today. So you spend any time in various chats where praxis becomes replaced by a kind of weak attempt at theory the whole time. And so simply rehearsing the same debates and takes just ends up taking the place of any kind of genuine commitment. And so the very act of speaking and debating people who are essentially on your side just becomes the main focus. And you just wait for the next take and everyone discusses it. And then you move from one thing to the other, and people end up without a rudder, and they end up repeating things that have been said years ago.
That's very true. I like that. I think that's probably the best place to end right there. This has been a fascinating talk, Mr. Hamilton, Mr. Witnat. And I want everyone who liked what they heard today to go out and look up Theopolitics and look up the Euro Bureau of Literature, which is a fine show that goes deep into a lot of the things that we discussed today. I think a few of the books that we mentioned specifically, there's entire episodes on with your friends Josh Neal, who's another a great guy, and a bunch of other people. You can find both those shows on Odyssey as well as on YouTube, and also to check out your Gumroad, where you can also get some of that exclusive content, correct?
For sure. And it was definitely awesome. It was actually good to finally talk to you, because I've been talking to you for a while, but never.
Yeah. Me and this guy have known each other for a while. I was on his chat and we're going back and forth. And yeah, he's always good. And we just started doing interviews recently. And I always had you on the list because when it comes to theology, especially, I'm not as well versed as I would like to be. And I think you can probably agree that once you get into that scene, you start discussing Christianity, and you saw this. Actually, anyway, let me say this. If anyone wants to see a pretty fun debate, you had debated on Keith Woods' show, Keith Woods Tonight, you debated Adam Green on Christianity. On the topic was supposed to be, was Jesus Christ real? But it kind of became about some other shit. But if you want to see this guy in action and see kind of the debate scene, look that up. That's on Odyssey. It's Adam Green, right? That's the guy?
Yeah, that was fun. I actually got a lot of messages from, and I still get them, from his followers saying I changed their mind. And so to me, that was definitely worth it. It was a bit frustrating because everything I said got met with something completely unrelated. I'd be like, yeah, I would explain something about historicity, and then I'd be met with, do you believe in miracles? But
yeah, well, the debate was supposed to be, did Jesus Christ really exist? And it seemed right away is like, well, yeah, but, and then I'm like, well, I guess so right away the debate's kind of over, but then it became like another hour or so of this other stuff, which is good. But if people like this sort of thing, if people like theoretical discussions, I'm trying to get more in the scene, because I can be made to look the fool very quickly when people are kind of saying, oh yeah, well, what about this obscure theologian? And I'm like, well, I know Spengler, I know Evola, I know Hitler. That's it. Anyway.
Well, if I might quickly interject, one thing I didn't get to was what the Catholic and truly Christian vision of the soul was. So I could
Okay.
say
Yeah.
that in like 1 minute. Basically, the early Christian vision, like in the first century and beyond, was actually in direct opposition to the Platonist vision, as well as any other philosophy and cult that was around at the time. Because the whole idea was that the body never resurrected, right? So the Christian vision, the Greek word was anastasis, which means physical bodily resurrection. In other words, actual resurrection of the body. There was no notion of a soul in the sense that your soul simply flies off to an ethereal realm. What you do have is like heaven more so as a waiting place. And Thomas Aquinas gets at this as well too. He takes over from Aristotle the notion that the soul is the form of the body to try to explain Christian theology. So he doesn't derive it from that. He's trying to explain Christian theology. And so the whole person, the Christian vision, actually requires a body. The end times vision is actually the resurrection of our bodies, right? You are a whole person by your body. The soul and the body, it's one, basically. And that is in relation to transcendence to God. And the whole of creation is in relation to transcendence to God, precisely in the fact that it's a real physical world. In comparison to what people think, Christianity is about some, you're supposed to like put off the cares of this world for some ethereal realm beyond. It's actually quite different. It's that Christ triumphs over the principalities and powers of the world. And so you're supposed to act as a Christian in this world to bring about the church and to live out that reality in the physical world. And the end times vision is physical bodily resurrection.
That's very good. Thank you for remembering that. I actually had that as my note to come back to, but I completely glossed over it. That is an even better place to end it for clarifying that.
One more sentence. That's where the material meets the metaphysical. Because what phenomenology does is it clears out bad ideas about what the soul is, what the body is, what the brain is, what consciousness is. And then with phenomenology and then its scientific expression and embodied cognition, which is making a lot of important discoveries in cognitive science from phenomenology, is that it confirms that vision which Aquinas put down years ago, which is that conscious intentionality is a body lived out towards the world in a way kind of like how the bowstring intends the arrow. And so there's where you find phenomenology clears out bad ideas, but then once you're there, you're in the realm of metaphysics.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.